Hello everybody. Today is episode 1 of Crash Course Ramen AP American Government. So, I got my ramen right here and I got my book right here, and we're just going to sprint through this. We're going to sprint through this from page 1. We're just going to be rolling through. So, page 1, page 2, pretty much a straightforward outline, starting with talking about the preamble and how the idea of the people has changed over time. Obviously, it started off with white male property owners and has now evolved into encompassing absolutely everyone. Of course, there's a few outliers, like our teacher obviously talked about, which is like felons is a big one, people in jail. But anyways, page 1 and page 2, pretty simple, not much to see here. Likewise here, it goes through page 4, kind of talking about how, in general, there was a positive look on the United States from the people to the government. Kind of changed in 9/11 with the terrorist attack. It kind of changed our whole definition of what tranquility looks like and how much the government should be involved in our own personal lives. You could also say the same for after the Great Depression. There was a lot of social government programs that were started, so that's something to consider as well. Now, the main thing this chapter is going to be talking about is roots of the American government, what they are, and why they're important. Second, origin of the ideas about the government. Third, American political culture, what that entails, what that encompasses. Fourth, political ideology, how that affects elections and how that affects our view on the world in general. Fifth, the changing characteristics of the American people. This largely has to do with a lot of times cultural changes over time, and that kind of ties right into demographic changes, population changes, and Americans' attitudes towards government. So what is government? The government is the formal vehicle through which policies are made and the affairs of state are conducted. Pretty straightforward, kind of interesting how the Greeks, it was a Greek word to pilot a ship, and the government is piloting the ship that we the people are on. That's kind of the idea I got from it. Now, a citizen, what is a citizen? A citizen is a member of the political community to whom certain rights and obligations are attached. A pretty straightforward definition. It then goes on to talk about, towards the bottom in the next page, what happens when there is opposition and when government starts to fall apart, how there's a void, and a lot of times what fills the void is violence. It's kind of a broad blanket statement. There are a few examples in history, but in general it doesn't go super into detail, totally fine. Now, what is politics? Made simply, it is who gets what, when, and how. Those three things. Who gets what, when, and how. Also, it's essentially the process of how policy is made and who makes those decisions. So, what are the functions of the government? We're running pretty quickly right now. We're on page 6 right now. Bottom left talks about the EU. Kind of interesting because this book was written before Brexit, which is kind of an interesting thing to note for some people if you're into following. British essentially pulled out of the EU. I just thought it was interesting because this book was kind of talking about how there is tension, and this book was written before Brexit. So just something to note. So, function of the government. When we're talking about the functions of the government, we're talking about, since this is American government we're talking about here, we're talking about the framers. Now, the framers are a really important group of people because they ended up writing a document that would go on to essentially be the ruling document that till the end and on with America. We can see that the Constitution had some very clear concepts, and there was also some areas that were a little bit fuzzy that were very open to interpretation, which is how we get our political parties today. The interpretation of the Constitution is fundamentally the core of essentially the political parties, is what I would put it as. So it talks about how the framers centered their belief that the major function of government was creating mechanisms to allow individuals to solve conflicts in an orderly and peaceful manner. Now, obviously, there are some main things that every government has, and that is what page 6, 7, and 8 is going to be talking about. So let's go ahead and talk about those. Establishing justice. This is the first and foremost, is that the first thing to be expected from government is a system of laws that allows individuals to abide by a common set of principles. That one's straight up. Essentially, if you don't have laws, it's chaos. I think without law, there's chaos. It's kind of a logical thing. That's kind of the purpose of why we put a government together, is so that we can all agree on certain things to maintain order and peace. Small note that's very interesting, that's really important. The Bill of Rights was created that guarantees the citizens certain rights. doesn't guarantee the government certain rights. It guarantees you, the citizen, certain rights. Really important. Bill of Rights is super awesome if you're a citizen. It entitles people to trial by jury and to be informed against charges by them, and to be tried in a courtroom presided over by an impartial judge. So that's the Bill of Rights is really intertwined with establishing justice. That's super, super cool for us. Bear in mind also that the Constitution created a federal judicial system. If you look back historically, how much power that federal judicial branch has evolved over time greatly. You've had certain periods in history where it really wasn't significant, and then there's certain times where it got flipped around and became a very significant part of what the government is today. So, number 2, ensuring domestic tranquility. This one's pretty straightforward. It's subject to much debate. In terms of when 9/11 happened, it changed a lot of things. And essentially, after 9/11, the U.S. government took very large steps to ensure said domestic tranquility. And that was in terms of creating the Department of Homeland Security and the passing of legislation that essentially gives them the right to, whenever there's a potential threat to Homeland Security, they can go in and essentially do what they have to do to ensure domestic tranquility, to put that in a very kind of dark tone. On a practical front, the local government have police forces, states have the National Guard, and the federal government can always call up troops to quell anything. So ensuring domestic tranquility is essentially a force that ensures establishing justice and all these other things happens. The next one is providing for the common defense, calls for the commander-in-chief to be commander of the armed forces. It gives the Congress the right to raise an army, and this is one of the most logical things, is that in order to have a country, you have to have a defense of that said country, or else people will come in and steal your land, etc. That's a little bit old-fashioned, but it's still true. You have to have an army to have a country for the most part, to some level. Number 4 is promoting the general welfare. Now, this is one of those things that when the framers initially wrote it, they didn't know how much the government would grow dramatically. And because of this, the notion of government has changed dramatically over time, and how we interpret what they meant by promoting the general welfare is once again another thing that causes the difference in political parties. One person's idea of promoting the general welfare could look completely opposite of what someone else thinks is promoting the general welfare. The last one is securing the blessings of liberty. Essentially, in a free society, citizens enjoy a wide range of liberties and freedoms and feel free to prosper. They are free to criticize the government and to petition it when they disagree with its policies or have a grievance. So why is this important? Why is this relevant to America? So the first example of a country that doesn't have blessing of liberty, or didn't, would have been, at its height, communism in Russia. You were not allowed to speak out against the government there, and therefore you didn't really have the liberty to go against it, to petition against it, to have any grievances against it. That was not allowed at all. Another part of blessings of liberty is kind of the agreement by citizens to honor American symbols, such as the flag, the eagle, and a little bit older, but the American Creed as well was kind of a big deal during the wartime. So just bear that in mind. So types of government. Now this is like your classic definition section, but let's still try to not get bored by just the simple definitions. They're still important. All these types of governments have happened in history, so they're relevant in history. So first one is monarchy, which is defined by a form of government in which power is vested in hereditary kings and queens who govern in the interests of all. But let's be honest, it means a rule by one. Although you could argue that kind of goes over with the totalitarianism, but I would still think monarchy is largely a rule of one. The only difference is totalitarianism is that it's the rule of one and all interest is whatever that one person wants, whereas a monarchy, you're supposed to have the interest of your subjects in mind. Okay, next one. Oligarchy occurs when a few people rule in their own interest. In an oligarchy, participation in government is conditioned on the possession of wealth, social status, military position, or achievement. And like the book says, oligarchies are relatively rare today. And finally, the one we all know and love, it is democracy. Comes from the Greek word demos, which means the people, and kratia, which means power or authority, the idea that power is vested in the people. Obviously has a lot of crossover with the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, Bill of Rights, all of those lovely documents. Ironically enough, just a little side note, Aristotle was actually afraid of democracy to some level. He still thought it was probably a better solution than one person ruling, but Aristotle was in fact afraid of democracy on some level. Take a quick pause here for our first bite of ramen, and if I had better video editing skills and time, this would be a dramatic segment where music comes on and probably a different overlay, but so good. Gotta fuel your political mind with ramen. That's why we're calling this the Ramen Crash Course of AP, Politics, and Government. Okay, the philosophical origins of American government, page number 9. So, where did our framers get their ideas from? The main thing where this came from was the Reformation and the Enlightenment. When Western Europe started to collapse, suddenly all your scientists, your philosophers, anyone who was of significance in the education system, rich people, even poor people, because yeah, like I said back then, times were a little bit different. If you're a poor person, you're kind of way behind in terms of education. But there was even everybody was kind of questioning what was going on, and this came out in the Reformation and the Enlightenment, and those eventually resulted in the questioning of divine right. There was groups that started questioning the church and the church's role in the government, and this eventually manifested itself in the Puritans. Now, the Puritans believed in essentially the power of the people, and they fled England to settle in America. They established a self-governing congregation. Now, what's important was the Mayflower Compact. Now, I'm sure you've all heard about it in elementary school. You saw in your little book a picture of like a ship and the Mayflower Compact, and you're like, why is this important? It's important because it was the first written document that was definitively a social contract between the people and the government. They all decided that they were going to be a part of a social contract. So what is a social contract? A social contract is an agreement between the people and their government signifying their consent to be governed. There you go, write that one down, folks. Pause the video, go back, rewind, listen to me. No, I'm just kidding. So, now where did that idea of social contract come from? It came from a few people. The main philosophers we're going to talk about is going to be, his full name is Thomas Hobbes, and our boy John Locke. Not Locke, Locke. Both of them, actually not both of them. Actually, never mind. It's the social contract 3, like I was saying in the previous one. Both Thomas Hobbes and John Locke believed in social contracts between the citizens and the government. So what's the difference between the two? Hobbes believed, and I quote right here, that a monarchy was necessary to restrain humanity's bestial tendencies because life without government was but a quote-unquote state of nature. He essentially thought that without government, everything would fall to chaos, and you needed one strong individual who could watch out for the people's interests, because he didn't believe people at an individual level could participate in a system where they could watch out for their own interests and be aware of where they're at. So he said that although kings can be evil, he thought it was the lesser of two evils. He talked about mob rule quite a bit, which is something that a lot of the colonists were afraid of, was mob rule, which is why it ended up being called a republic, not a democracy. Just a side note right there. So, in contrast, John Locke believed in the 3 beautiful words we all know and love, which is life, liberty, and property. These were the main reasons to separate from England. They believed that those were guaranteed rights that they should have. Also, another side note that is interesting is Locke believed that the portion of government that created laws should be the most powerful branch. What's that? Oh, it's Congress. Amazing. What an amazing coincidence. Think that's a coincidence? I don't think it's a coincidence. That's our boy John Locke living on in time. What else do we have here? Oh, essentially Declaration of Independence. Thomas Jefferson was like, I'm just going to copy Locke, pretty much. And now Thomas Jefferson's a famous dude. Kind of interesting how that goes. Anyways, devising a national government in the American colonies, page number 11. So, the American colonists rejected a strong ruler. But what did they put in place? Initially, the colonists had a direct democracy where everybody would gather. Well, not everyone, not the woman. Nobody cares about the woman. Back in the day, they're like, oh my gosh, we don't care about you guys. You guys aren't smart, which is really silly. Really, really silly. Just gonna throw that out there. Anyways, they decided that they were gonna have a direct democracy where everybody gathered in town halls and they would vote. The problem is that as more and more people started coming over into the Americas, suddenly you can't have 20, 30,000 people voting on one thing. It's actually incredibly confusing. So what happened is we had indirect democracy. Now, two things. Indirect democracy, republic. Indirect democracy, republic, totally interchangeable. Completely interchangeable, the two things. So they would elect representatives that would then go on and represent them and vote for them. Sounds like something that maybe the United States does. Oh yeah, that is what we do. Interesting how that goes. And like I was saying earlier about our boy Hobbes warned about mob rule, so the people were uncomfortable with the term democracy, which is why they preferred to use the term republic, which implied a system of government in which the interests of the people were represented by more educated or wealthier citizens who were responsible to those who elected them. So representative officials, essentially. And I guess the definition: direct democracy, a system of government in which members of the polity meet to discuss all policy decisions and agree to abide by the majority rule. And indirect democracy is a system of government that gives citizens the opportunity to vote for representatives who will work on their behalf. Wow, that is a mouthful, folks. They know how to make the longest definitions they know to describe something. Absolutely amazing. So, bottom of page number 11, we have American political culture and the basic tenets of American democracy. So, we're going to be talking about here is political culture. Now, what is the political culture in America? It is essentially the commonly shared beliefs and core values about how the government should operate. It's the kind of the agreement all Americans have, or somewhat have, that they believe the government should do for them. What does that involve? Two main things: personal liberty and equality. Now, what is personal liberty? Personal liberty is a key characteristic of U.S. democracy, initially meaning freedom from governmental interference. Today, it includes demands for freedom to engage in a variety of practices without governmental interference or discrimination. So, really important. The concept of liberty initially was freedom from. When the framers kind of created, it was freedom from Britain, freedom from oppression. But that 200 years later, that is evolved to freedom to do this. I have the freedom to move about freely. All of these things, it moved from to, so that's really important with personal liberty, is to note that. And eventually we've added on amendments, we've added on things that have guaranteed our civil rights, because initially, the initial definition that outlined what we believed in was not enough. Next is political equality. It's the idea that one person, one vote. The idea that we're all equal in politics. I have one vote, you have one vote, the richest man in America has one vote. Therefore, we're all on equal terms. Historically, though, there's people excluded. African Americans were excluded, women were excluded, we had all sorts of minorities that were excluded, but over time, that changed, that got ratified, and now pretty much everyone has one vote, one person, one vote. Now, what's changed, though, is that, in theory, everybody should be able to get elected into office, but unfortunately, in order to run a campaign to reach out to a large majority of people to get votes, you gotta be rich, so there's kind of not equality there. We don't really know what to do with it, but it's kind of how it is. So, three major terms we're going to talk about right now. On the bottom of page 12, popular consent, majority rule, and popular sovereignty. So, popular consent, the principle that governments must draw their power from the consent of the governed. Pretty straightforward. Popular consent, it's an agreement with the government, with the people. It was derived from John Locke's social contract theory, and it was central to the Declaration of Independence. Pretty straightforward. Now, majority rule. Majority rule is the idea that whoever wins, we're going to follow them. Now, immediately, if you've read the chapter, you should know what comes with majority rights. The answer is minority rights, something that's really been emphasized. With majority rights come minority rights. You can see this with the anger during the Civil Rights Act movement, and also post-Civil War African Americans, the rights that they essentially didn't get. So even if the majority is in power, we still have to be concerned with the minority. It's really, 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 really important. Next, popular sovereignty is the notion that the ultimate authority in society rests with the people. and has its basis in John Locke's natural laws, those three things: life, liberty, property, that all people are born with and should have. So, essentially, political authority rests with the people who can create, abolish, or alter their government. That's, once again, the idea of the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. It did not come into wide use until pre-Civil War debates over slavery, popular sovereignty. Just to note that that term wasn't around before that. Next one is civil society. Civil society is created when citizens are allowed to organize and express their views publicly as they engage in open debate about public policy. I kind of talked about this earlier. Russia is the perfect example of a society that was not allowed for the longest of time to engage in civil society. The book actually uses that example. And also to note that a lot of Americans take civil society for granted. Break number 2 for some more ramen. I'm sorry, guys. I'm having another bite. I'm getting hungry. We're at the middle of page 13 right now. We're working our way through. Yeah. Let me tell you, folks. Ramen, I'll take this over a political debate any day of the week. Any day. Wow. So much sodium. Tastes so good. Next thing. Bottom of page 13. Individualism. Individualism is something that is entrenched in American values. Bear in mind, this whole section is talking about political culture. Personal liberty, equality, popular consent, majority rule, popular sovereignty, civil society, and individualism are all a part of our political culture. And once again, it's the idea that individuals are extremely important, that we don't want to force people into a group mentality. You can see that in Canada, where it's kind of like group before individual and certain political type of things. That's like universal health care. Whereas in the United States, we had like our Wild West, where people wanted to go farm without any government essentially over them. Which, ironically enough, over time, as everything grew and cities grew around those farms, eventually those people were forced to interact and not be as individualistic. But it still has stuck with Americans, the idea of the rugged American individual that can do it all. I could be a businessman, I could be an astronaut, I can do whatever in the world I want. Religious faith and religious freedom. Pretty important one. Essentially, the book describes how Christians, how majority religion, but how, in general, voters have seen candidates who have a strong religious faith as a good thing. It also talked about the conflict between Islam and Christianity just a tiny bit, talked about it just a little bit, and just in general, freedom to be religious is like just an important characteristic of the United States. You can do whatever the heck you want as long as you don't harm others. You can believe in whatever you want. So, political ideology, bottom page 14, let's get started. So, political ideology is the coherent set of values and beliefs people hold about the purpose and scope of the government in the actions of individuals. So, ideologies are sets or systems of beliefs that shape the thinking of individuals and how they view the world, especially in regard to the issues of race, nationality, the role and function of the government, the relations between men and women, human responsibility for the natural environment, and many other matters. That is essentially what a political ideology is. Kind of a long list, but increasingly more and more with how many people there are, people are turning to their political ideology to kind of maneuver how they see the world and what they believe is right and wrong in terms of the government, politics, social issues, everything. It's kind of a big deal. So what does it do for you? It gives you an explanation. They provide us with a reason for why social and political conditions are the way they are. They allow us to evaluate. Ideologies can provide the standards for evaluating social conditions and political institution and events. And orientation is number 3. Ideologies can provide us a sense of identity, whether you are male or female, native-born or foreign-born, for example. He was talking about how Oprah Winfrey voted for Obama as opposed to Hillary during the primary, and how her identity as a African American was stronger than her identity as a woman. That's kind of a part of political ideology, where you put yourself on the compass of what's important, what's not important. And finally, political program. It helps people vote, essentially. Are you conservative, Republican, moderate, libertarian, liberal, far left, far right, radical, not radical, doesn't matter. It helps you vote. So, now we're moving on to prevailing American political ideology. So as you can see in the book right here, turn the book around. You can see the bottom left that moderates are the most common group. People don't like to be boxed in, so they call themselves moderates, but they do. So, for the most part, moderates reign supreme. They're the most fought over group. But we're going to first talk about, on the top of page 16, Libertarians are people who favors free market economy and no government interference in personal liberty. So this is essentially the guy that doesn't want government, doesn't like government. I don't like my government. I don't want the government. I don't want you to touch me. I want my freedom to do what I want. I want to do what I want. I want to be able to do my business. I don't want taxes really. I just kind of want to do my own thing, you know? I'm a libertarian. And then we got the conservatives. The conservative one believes that a government is best that governs least, and that big government can only infringe on individual, personal, and economic rights. Along with this are your social conservatives that believe are against same-sex marriage. They're against gay rights. They want essentially the government to regulate certain moral and ethics standards that they believe to be true. But you also have your conservatives in general want slow change. They don't want fast change. They want incremental change. That's kind of a theme of conservatives. They're also known for wanting a lot of fiscal responsibility. They're oftentimes the people preaching about budget. I want a good budget, they say. I mean, that's what everyone wants, right? Finally, liberal is one who seeks to change the political, economic, and social status quo to foster the development of equality and the well-being of individuals. The term liberal and what it implies and what it means has changed over time, and in general, it's essentially all about the rights of the people to do what they want, and if you're a minority or if you've been beat down, we should help you out, because, you know, you deserve to have compensation for what happened, you know. That's kind of a theme with liberalisms, which is, what's the term I'm looking for? Affirmative action. They believe in affirmative action, and you hopefully you know what that means. If you don't know what it means, Google it. Affirmative action, liberals, hand in hand. Finally, what's the problem with political labels? So the problem is that the majority of people are like, I'm a conservative, but then they might be like, but actually I believe in this social issue or this social issue that might be completely liberal. Vice versa for a liberal, they might have an economic view that a conservative has. So a lot of times people are like, I'm over here, but then in certain issues they're way over here. They can be complete flip-flops. So it's kind of confusing because we're throwing people into boxes of like, oh, he's a conservative, you're a Republican, you're a liberal, you're a libertarian. The reality is they're all mashed up in the middle. They're all kind of a mishmash, but people still kind of identify as something or something or something. So it helps voting, it helps polling. It's just kind of so we can get an idea where everyone's out from right to left. Changing characteristics of the American people. Page 17. Americans have many things in common beyond their political culture, including a high regard for symbols. Blah, 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 blah. What's going on here? What's going on here? I'm talking about the American dream. Okay, what's going on here? Alright. Bottom page 17 feels pretty worthless to me. I'm not going to lie, folks. Don't read the bottom of page 17. It's not doing anything for you. I'll probably get that question wrong in the test right there. That'll be the one. Alright, what do we got here? So, changing size and population, top of page 18. Essentially, we're growing. And because we're growing, your government officials have to represent a larger and larger and larger and larger and larger and larger group, because the framers set a specific amount of people that were a part of the House and a part of the Congress and a part of the Senate. So, because of that, it's very hard for politicians to represent the interests of the people that voted them in, because it's such a large group. One person from Montana has to represent over 944,000 people. 944,000! Think about that for a moment. That's so many people. So, along with changing size and population is changing demographics of the United States population, specifically the changes in racial and ethnic composition. In 1967, way huge majority right, but just essentially what's happening is more and more your Hispanic group is growing, your African American group is growing, your Asian Pacific Islanders are growing, and all your others are growing, and your white group is shrinking. It can do with that white people in general are having less kids, and those other ethnicities are having more kids. And there's also more immigrants coming out that aren't necessarily white. That's the main contributing factor in terms of what's happening. The book also talks about how we've had different periods of extreme immigration and how that's affected. One thing we can also talk about here too, because I feel like a lot of this is pretty general information. I don't feel like it's too critical. The idea is ethnic conclaves and how that can affect your local society. Something to just consider and debate about. Are ethnic conclaves of other cultures a good or bad thing? That's just an interesting question to throw out there. So we're on page 20 right now, and we're talking about the changes in family sizes. Essentially, the family size and household arrangements can be affected by several factors, including the age at first marriage, divorce rates, economic conditions, longevity rates, and the improvements in healthcare. So what's kind of happening in general is people are kind of like, more and more as time's gone on, they're like, I don't want kids. Kids are really expensive. Kids are super, 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 super expensive. And because of this, your old group, because there's not as many kids being born, are actually becoming a very large group of people. It also happens because of the baby boom, all that wonderful stuff. So, toward reform, page 21. Population changes and American attitudes towards the government. Today, 86% of Americans believe that illegal immigration is a serious problem. This page is talking about essentially how there's been different periods in time where a huge influx of immigrants come in, everybody freaks out, and then it's actually okay. That's pretty much in, what's here? Also talking about the rift between young Americans, old Americans. Old Americans have interests that don't line up with the young Americans, and as a result of this, it's become a us versus them mentality, something important to consider. The Huntington theory of Hispanization, and that's what I was talking about with ethnic conclaves. I'm not going to talk about that. That page you can read on your own. So, page 24. Attitudinal change and reform. This page is talking about the American dream, which is really important because I like the American dream. An American ideal of happy and successful life, which often includes wealth, a house, and a better life for one's children. Kind of interesting. Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. And we can throw property in there, which is a John Locke concept. It's kind of the things that make up the American dream, ironically enough, is what John Locke believed every person had a right to. So the American dream is what every person should have a right to, in my opinion. That's just crucify me, hang me on a cross, but I believe in. What else do we have here? We're talking about how information has become so quick and how it circulates, and how Americans are constantly, their views are being tugged and pulled and shifted and changed, where you have your news networks, your blogs, your internet, your Twitter, everything is constant feed of information. And a lot of times with millennials and our current day of technology, we don't necessarily take the time to check the validity and accuracy and the bias of our sources, and it's just something that's kind of interesting. And what else do we have here? Oh, just how in general, because of the ease of information, citizens are becoming more and more involved in politics because how easy it is to access information. Also, we're just talking about how, in terms of abroad, the world's view has become more and more progressively negative about the United States, something to consider. Also talking about how there's super, super high expectations on our politicians and how it's very difficult to make quick change. People often want quick change, but it's very hard to create quick change. What else do we got here? Talking about how everybody hates George Bush. In terms of statistics, true, page 25. Alright. And essentially, after 9/11, a lot of Americans lack faith in our country's institutions, but how it's interesting during times of crisis, we look to the government for help. So we lack faith, and yet we want them to be there. It's kind of a double standard. We kind of blame all of our woes on the government, and yet we expect the government to be there when we want them to help us. The book goes to talk about how much the government has control over, not control, that's the wrong word. The lights, the electric company, government regulates that. Your water, that gets regulated by the government. What your water composition is regulated by the government. Anything advertising, anything on the internet, not anything on the internet. Anything food related, anything car related, everything, regulations on absolutely everything. The government has certain sets and standards that is put in place. Every day you interact with the government and you're not even aware of it for small daily things. What time zone you're in, that's something the government sets up. Also, it's interesting, there's a graph, upper left corner of page 26. Essentially, Congress for the longest time had the best political view, but it's taken a big nosedive lately. Pretty much all the institutions, there's not much faith left in them. So, we're running through this page, and really I feel like the last from page 24 to 27, which is the end, I feel like it's very broad information you have to read for yourself. I didn't feel like it was super important. So in summary of this chapter, what are the roots of the American government? Government, which are made up of individuals and institutions, are the vehicles through which policies are made and affairs of state are conducted. We need government to maintain order because governments alone can use force legitimately. That's very important because only the government can use force legitimately. Governments have many functions. In terms of the United States, they're included in the Preamble to the Constitution and Bill of Rights, Declaration of Independence, all those lovely things. What are the philosophical origins of the American government? We talked about that with our boy John Locke and Hobbes and all that freedom stuff. I want to talk about the last three because those are the ones I think were the most broad in the book, so let's talk about those quick. So what is the role of political ideology in the United States and the world? Ideology is the belief system that shape the thinking of individuals and how they view the world, play a powerful role in politics here and abroad. Most Americans identify themselves as conservatives, liberals, or moderates, and the ever-growing Third Party, Green Party, Libertarian Party, all those beautiful parties. What are the changing characteristics of the American people? Several characteristics of the American electorate can help us understand how the system continues to evolve and change. Chief among these are the changes in size, population, and demographics. How do population changes and American attitudes toward government affect policies and efforts toward reform? Shifts in population have created controversy in the American electorate throughout America's history. Membership in a demographic group is likely to affect one's outlook on government policies. Moreover, Americans have a high and often unrealistic expectation of government, yet often fail to appreciate how much their government actually does for them. Americans' failing trust in institutions also explains some of the apathy evidenced in the electorate. Anyways, guys, that is the end of chapter... Wait for it. And I haven't said it yet. That's the end of Chapter 1, the political landscape. Thanks for watching Crash Course Ramen. I think that's what I'm going to call it. Crash Course Ramen with American AP, government, and politics. Thanks for watching, guys. I enjoyed it. I'm hoping to do this every day. This is more of a review for me than you, but if you get absolutely anything out of it, congratulations. That's awesome. That's amazing. I'm going to go ahead and end this video, but if you enjoyed it yourself, be sure to like and subscribe. Throw me a comment if you enjoyed and learned something valuable.